Germany. Now, there is a place that has long had a problem with the far right, and a new report from the country's equivalent of MI5 has discovered that right-wing extremism is the greatest threat to German democracy. It also identified as many as 14,000 violent right-wing extremists living there. Now, you may recall that late last year, 25 people were arrested on suspicion of plotting to overthrow the government. The majority of them were members of something known as the Reichsbürger movement, those who reject the authority and legitimacy of the German state and seek to ignore, replace, or even overthrow it. Now, the resurgence of extremist politics in a country perhaps most associated with the rise and spread of fascism is obviously worrying. So too, the growth of extremism being witnessed in other parts of Europe, including the UK. But what's not immediately obvious, to me at least, is what is fueling this extremist resurgence, let alone what can be done about it. Welcome to The Daily. I'm Niall Paterson.
Cards on the table, this has to have been possibly one of the most surreal experiences I've had in the last year.
Siobhan Robbins is Sky's Europe Correspondent.
So I was investigating the right wing within Germany, and as part of that, I'd heard about this guy who was calling himself the King of Germany. He'd created his own kingdom. And so I got in contact with them and we decided to go and have a chat. We went down to the kingdom, which is about 2 hours outside Berlin. So this is the kingdom?
No, it's just the village. The kingdom is just an area.
So I drove up to the gates and there was basically a corrugated iron gate painted in green, like a kind of forest scene. And on the outside it said Kingdom of Germany.
Hello.
When I got into the drive, there was a little desk set up and I was asked to fill out some information so that I could get a visa.
This is my ID for a visa, please.
Because, of course, I was visiting from outside the kingdom, and so I had to have a one-day visa to get in. So I presented my identity, got the visa, and then went into this very unassuming building to wait for this king.
How do I address you? Do you have a title?
Yes.
What do we say then?
King of Germany.
So I say, Your Majesty.
Yes.
So, yeah, I guess give me a little tour of the kingdom, of your kingdom. So basically, his idea is that from around a decade ago, he decided to start the Kingdom of Germany, as they've called it, which is a group now of around just over 5,000 people. And they essentially don't accept the elected government and the current system within Germany. So they've created their own kingdom, which has its own rules. They've created their own ID. So he's got his own special passport. He's changed his name. So when he flies within Germany, he flies as King Peter I. They have their own banking system. And he showed me they've got old silver coins, and also they're going to roll out some banknotes as well. If other people in Germany accept it, he would like to see the Kingdom of Germany basically take over the whole of Germany as we know it, so that everyone living in Germany would be part of the kingdom.
You say he's incredibly charming. I'm just wondering if he's entirely the full shilling. I mean, you can't just buy a patch of land, stick up a corrugated fence, and call it your kingdom. Otherwise, frankly, I'd have done that 20 years ago.
Well, I asked him these questions, and he's quite clear that this isn't some sort of crackpot idea in his mind. This is an idea to make society work better. So he claims people who are within the kingdom, if they work for the kingdom, then they get their food for free, for example.
For free.
Oh, so they can come and get the food for free?
Yes, all food for free.
Every day?
Yeah, every day. Yes.
Wow. So they
Not
don't
only food for free, also gasoline for free, car for free, rent for free.
He claims the current system in Germany is totally unfair, that the monetary system is unfair, and so he's trying to create this alternative. But of course, you can imagine that someone who's declaring their own state and saying, actually, we'd like to see the current government dissolved and our state put in, doesn't play that highly on the views of the authorities within Germany. So he says that he has been under surveillance, and certainly as part of a report about extremism and potential domestic threats within Germany, the Kingdom of Germany is on that. And they are being monitored because of the fact that they've said they've created their kingdom, but also because they're being held together with a group a sort of quite disparate group within Germany, which are called Reichsbürger. And essentially, Reichsbürger as a whole are lots of different groups, but together they all believe that the current system is wrong. And some of them believe that basically the current government is illegal and that the German state should revert to how it was before the war, so that they want to get rid of post-war Germany as we now know it.
Okay, I can understand why you might describe someone who wants to secede from your country as an extremist. I'm not entirely certain why one would describe them as far right.
So the thing about the Reichsbürger is it's not just the kingdom, which the domestic authorities in German count in this group. There are around 23,000 Reichsbürger within Germany. And just before Christmas, we saw a group of people being arrested, 25 people, as part of raids to foil what the authorities say was a Reichsbürger plot to violently overthrow the government in Germany. Now, this wasn't connected to the Kingdom of Germany or King Peter. King Peter is very clear that none of his followers or he would support any type of violent coup to take over the government. But it was part of this Reichsbürger movement. And as part of this report, they've said around 10% of people who believe in this Reichsbürger are potentially violent. And that's why they're watching.
Okay, look, I mean, the figure of 14,000 violent right-wing extremists is clearly concerning, but I'd submit that more concerning than that is sitting in the Reichstag at the moment, you have far-right extremist politicians. Now, of course, they would say they are neither violent nor divisive, but surely it is still concerning to see politicians with far-right views sitting in a parliament so closely associated with fascism.
Yes, so one of the groups which is causing concern, particularly within the left wing, is the AfD, Alternative for Germany Party, which has 78 seats in Parliament and elements of it are being watched by the security services. So, for example, one of what we call within that party, one of the right-wing poster boys has been charged with using a slogan which was apparently used by elements of the Nazi party. And certainly I spoke to a man called Suleiman Malik, who lives in East Germany, and he claims that he has been a victim of far-right extremism, which he believes that elements like the AfD are stoking. So he's been trying to build a mosque for 10 years. And part of the delay to that is because he said that workmen who were trying to come and work on the site were being threatened, being told that they shouldn't go and work for Muslims, that one day he turned up and that there was a pig's head on a stake and pork scattered around the site, that he's received numerous death threats as well. And he believes that there really is a concerning rise in right-wing thoughts in Germany.
Do you think there would be a lot of support if there was a coup that installed a right-wing government?
Yes, there will be.
You think there is?
Yes, there will be. There is.
Why?
Because they see that this is the solution. We saw the pictures in USA.
The fact you can't rule out the risk is because just in December, we saw these 25 arrests, which are allegedly connected to a plot to violently overthrow the government and to violently invade Parliament here in Germany. And that's why the authorities here are so vigilant. They said that right-wing extremism is the biggest threat domestically to democracy in Germany. That's how seriously they're taking it.
We must never underestimate the murderous danger posed by right-wing extremism and right-wing terrorism. That's the conclusion drawn by Germany's Interior Minister following the Security Service report, which identified that there were almost 39,000 right-wing extremists. Now, that is a figure up by more than 5,000 in just a year. But why? Julia Ebner is an academic specialising in radicalisation and right-wing extremism, and the author of Going Mainstream, How Extremists Are Taking Over.
Unfortunately, this is exactly what I've also observed in my own research. I've also done a number of undercover investigations into far-right extremist movements, including in Germany. And I've seen that the language there has become more aggressive and that the membership numbers have really risen to unseen levels, especially the pandemic, but also the Ukraine war and the ongoing economic and energy crisis and inflation crisis. All of that has caused a lot of frustrations within the German population, especially when it comes to the German politicians. So all of this has really widened societal divisions and has also caused a very high support for Germany's far-right populist party, the AfD.
You mentioned a number of reasons there, Julia, for the rise in extremism. You mentioned, the Ukraine conflict, obviously COVID. I mean, there would be those sitting outside of Germany that would have immediately thought, well, presumably Germany's fascist past has quite a lot to do with it as well.
It does also play a role, certainly. There's still a taboo in terms of speaking about nationalism, speaking about kind of pride. National pride is still something that is not really socially acceptable. And that has been of concern for many Germans who wanted to take pride in their country, in their origins. And that's also something that the far right has been able to tap into. And unfortunately, there have also been, of course, a number of crises where Germany has been particularly hard hit in the past. The so-called migration and refugee crisis a few years ago, but also the kind of security crisis that we saw with the rise of ISIS and a number of attacks, jihadist attacks that Germany has faced. Then that meant that anti-migration and xenophobic ideas could really penetrate the mainstream.
On the basis of that, one has to presume that these views are being shared most prominently online, that this is where the spread of these ideologies is most active.
It certainly is. And Germany is, I would say, based on my research, is one of the top countries when it comes to alternative media outlets and so-called citizen journalism, where a lot of these alternative media outlets position themselves in opposition to the so-called mainstream media, which is, of course, also a term that has then closely been associated with the old Nazi term Lügenpresse, which is now increasingly used by far-right extremists today in Germany, the lying press, basically, that actually often promote conspiracy myths and dangerous narratives and often a lot of disinformation about migrants, about, in general, minority communities, and about leading politicians. That has really also further amplified the dynamics that we're seeing.
Talk to me a little then about the Reichsbürger movement, because it seems fascinating to me that there is this loose collective of individuals who feel that the state doesn't represent them, to the extent that they wish to rise up, some of them, to overthrow the democratic constitutional norms of a country like Germany. Where does this come from? Because it does look associated with that which I would more typically call the far right, the fascist, the racist, the homophobic and so on. But it also seems slightly distinct to that as well.
It is. There's a strong overlap with the wider far-right extremist community. But as you say, it's a network of mainly anti-democratic, anti-institutional extremists or sovereign citizens who don't accept the constitution, the German constitution, and who partly would also turn to violence in order to overthrow the current government. Of course, not all of them can be seen as violent, but the number of Reichsbürger or of German sovereign citizens has also strongly risen in recent years. And it's no longer a fringe phenomenon. It's really in the tens of thousands. Some of them just refuse to pay taxes, but others might even consider resorting to violence. There have been plots to overthrow the German government, but even that is, of course, quite delusional and would be extremely unrealistic. But as we've seen with the US Capitol riots, even if it's an unsuccessful plot to storm a democratic institution or to enter a democratic institution, that can trigger a whole mass phenomenon of people further potentially being inspired by that, but also causing a lot of terror and a lot of fear, not just within policy circles, but also within the wider population. So I wouldn't underestimate to what extent they can influence the overall debate and the atmosphere in the country.
I suppose the key difference between England, the UK and Germany is that at this point, we do not have political representation of those far-right organisations in the mainstream. It still exists on the fringes. Why has it been tolerated in the mainstream in Germany?
That is a very good question. In the German mainstream, I would say that because the centrist parties have distanced themselves from these ideologies, that there was a representative vacuum that could be filled by the Alternative for Germany. But even the alternative, the far-right populist party, the Alternative for Germany, radicalized a lot over the last 10 years since it was founded. You could really observe that the language is now flirting with conspiracy myths, with extremist ideologies that are becoming much more visible. They've, of course, always been kind of embedded within the party's overall thinking and approach, but the party was originally founded actually as an anti-EU party, so not so different from kind of UKIP's goals. And what we've seen in the UK is also that, of course, within the Conservative Party, there has been a bit more of kind of taking up some of the audiences that would have otherwise potentially voted for fringe parties. I would say that the Conservative Party in the UK has sometimes also flirted with these audiences, kind of using anti-migration rhetoric, sometimes even giving a little wink to conspiracy myth communities. And that is something that has helped them to at least keep out the more radical extremist parties who've not really managed to get into power. But overall, it still tells us something about the wider societal atmosphere, which might still be one where extremism can thrive and can actually become mainstream.
I suppose the issue is that, whereas in your mind's eye, we may believe fascists to be, shaven-headed, jack-booted idiots, these days you're as likely to see them dressed in an expensive suit, speaking in, the German parliament.
Definitely, it's been quite an experience also in my undercover investigations that sometimes I could not really tell apart who the extremists actually were. And that even applies to the most extreme of extremists, the neo-Nazis, who are no longer recognizable in their clothing, where there's been a whole new trend of rebranding and making sure that they're seen as socially acceptable and as representative of the overall population, so they can also attract new members who are average citizens.
Some of the parallels we were just discussing there between England and Germany, frankly, you could provide plenty of evidence that there is similar activity in large parts of the United States amongst the Republican movement. Tell me a little bit about the States and Europe.
The US is, of course, a very good example of a radicalization of politics that we could observe, especially since the rise to power of Trump in 2016, where it's almost as if the Republicans have forgotten what the party stands for, because Trump doesn't really represent any form of conservatism anymore. It's much more radical than that. So it's interesting how also the attitudes within the population have, of course, changed over the years and have become partly more radical. We've seen that in surveys, for example, conducted by the University of Chicago, that showed the high support rates within the US populations for the insurrectionist movement behind the US Capitol riots. So there is a question of what radicalized first, the politicians or the voters.
I wonder, however, though, through your research, you will have seen, I'm sure, evidence that these groups in different parts of the world, but sharing some kind of central core ideas, they are talking to each other, they're communicating with each other, and they are advising each other.
There's absolutely a very strong international collaboration or even coalition that has formed on the far right, but also among hyper-conservative players. So evangelical movements in the US that have been funding activities in Europe, campaigns against the LGBTQ community, against abortion rights. We've seen the first consequences of that also showing up in European politics and on the other side of the Atlantic. And that's, of course, very concerning.
My thanks to Julia and Siobhan, and that is your lot for today's edition of The Daily with me, Niall Paterson. This episode was produced by Rosie Gillett with Alex Eden and Amy Lakin. Our editor is Adam J.